Hey everyone, welcome to Script and Style, the web show where we talk about web development and the people that make it happen. I'm Todd Gardner from Track.js JavaScript Error Monitoring, and my co-host David Walsh, creator of the popular blog davidwalsh.name. How's it going today, David?
Good, but not as good as you, apparently. Hearing about your lunch, it sounded pretty awesome.
Yeah, the social networks today told me that it was National Cheeseburger Day, and so I felt the need to go downtown and find myself a cheeseburger and a couple of beers, and it was a good lunch. It was a good lunch.
Okay, so what do you get on your burger? What's your? Are you like do you spice it up, or are you just keep it simple?
It depends. Today I got like the special burger that they built for today, which was it was a 50-50 mix of like bacon and ground chuck. So it was like a really juicy burger to begin with. And then they'd put like this blend of like Swiss cheese with ghost peppers in it. And so it was like a really spicy cheese with like sweet pickles and like it was excellent. It was excellent. Not a traditional burger maybe, but it was fully enjoyable.
Were you sweating a bit?
A little bit. That's why I needed 2 beers. It wasn't that I wanted to have 2 beers. It's that I needed to have 2.
So it wasn't because you didn't want to deal with me. So I'm going to say something controversial coming from a Wisconsinite. I'm way more for burgers than I am brats. Okay. I might need to go into hiding after this, but it's like a juicy burger is so much better than whatever they stuff into the casing of what they call a brat. I don't know.
I feel like maybe you just haven't had the right brat.
I like chorizo.
Chorizo's solid. But like it's not the same thing. It's not the and
I'm thankful it's not the same thing because chorizo's way better, but I'm all for a good juicy burger. So I'm glad that you went out and did that. I'm going to do that later.
You totally should. But we have a guest today. Enough about that. Who's our guest today?
Kyle Simpson, also known as Getify.
Also known as You Don't Know JS.
Well, you don't have to insult me, but yes. So Kyle Simpson is a well-known JavaScript developer, evangelist, conference speaker, college football fan, I'm now told.
Yes, very much.
He authored the You Don't Know JS series, which I was so what's the word? Proud to write one of the forwards to. That was really cool. You're also an O'Reilly partner. We were partners of O'Reilly at the same time, as well as the creator of popular JavaScript libraries like Lab.js was the first loader that my blog used, and A-Sequence, which you wrote a few blog posts about on my blog. Thank you very much for that. And you're currently working on Calf and Facey, as well as DevCo, and we'll get to those in a second. But Kyle, how are you doing?
I'm great, and thanks, guys. I appreciate David and Todd, both of you guys having me on. It's a fantastic podcast, so it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. So Todd, let's welcome to the show with the usual question.
All right. So as is tradition with all of our guests, we like to know a little bit about your background. Where did you come from? How did you get into this crazy world of web development? And so we'd like to know, as a superhero of web development, what is your origin story?
All right, I'll give you a 2-part origin story. So I'll split this in half.
Part 1 and part 2.
Part 1 of the origin story is all the way back in 1990. I was 10 or 11 years old back then, and I was hanging out at a friend's house, and we were playing video games. We went into the den where his dad was working on a computer, and he was, clicking, typing away at a keyboard, and we wanted to know what he was doing, so we just started peppering him with questions about, what are you doing and how does that work? And he kind of described this idea of computer programming, and I don't even remember the conversation, honestly. I just remember that we were curious. But he said, hold on just a moment. And he clicked for like about a minute. And then he hit the enter key, and this was in the days of DOS. This is pre-Windows. A blue ASCII screen comes up with a gray box in the middle and my name in it. And I was completely hooked. The idea that he could type a few things and make that computer print my name in the middle of the screen was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Way better than any of the video games. And of course, I, like everybody, as soon as you figure out programming, you're like, okay, what game can I go make with this?
Right.
So me and my friend were like, we're determined to go make our own video games. And so that's how I got into programming. And I'm one of those rare folks that, you know, at the age of 10 or whatever, 11, I said, that's what I want to do. And I followed through with it. I kept doing it. I did that all the way through high school. I got a CS degree, became a programmer. So that's part one of the origin story. And I did start working as a developer. That was in the late 90s, and the rise of the web was happening. And so it was a good time to be a web developer. And I had worked on a lot of different stacks, but had found that I was enjoying JavaScript a lot. And so part two of the origin story is how I really doubled down on JavaScript. And that's in part because there were jobs there, and I made an early bet that there was going to be a thing like a JavaScript developer. Some people listening here don't even remember a time when that wasn't a job title. You were a webmaster or something like that. But I made an early bet that there was going to be a thing like JavaScript developer, that was going to be a specialty that people cared about. And so I had, you know, in 2006, 2007, really doubled down on learning it, and had gotten to the point where I felt pretty solid with JavaScript, and was then speaking about it at conferences. That was 2009. I was doing open source projects. So we fast forward to 2011, and I interviewed at a company called Twitter. Some of you may have heard of it. And I knew several people on the team, and they were saying, hey, we want you to come join this team. It sounds like you're great. You obviously know JavaScript, so let's have you come join this team. And so I flew up there and did an interview and was real jazzed. It seemed like it went well. And then I never heard anything for like 3 weeks. And I was like, what? You know, I thought everything was great, and then didn't. So when I contacted their HR department, their recruiters, and I said, you know, I took an entire day off of work to fly up there. I feel like I deserve at least some kind of, you know, statement of what happened or what was a mismatch or whatever, not just this usual brush off that a lot of candidates get. And they didn't want to give me anything. They gave me the typical thing, but I pushed the issue several times in email, and I said, no, I deserve it. I know people on the team who said they liked me, so there must be some reason, and I feel like I deserve to know what that reason was. So after about a week of pushing on them, the HR person came back and said, one of the interviewers came back and said that he didn't really think you knew much JavaScript. And I had your reaction. I started laughing at the HR person. Not in an egotistical sense, but like, of all the possible things that could have been wrong, there's plenty of my flaws, plenty of things that they could find to criticize about me, but it felt like criticizing me being all in on JavaScript was not one of them. And so that phrase stuck with me. And that is one of the reasons why I decided to write the You Don't Know JS book series, was because I was told that I didn't know JavaScript. And so I determined to go solve that problem, not only for myself, but for other people. So there's part two of the origin story. That's how I became a writer and a teacher about JavaScript, is at least in part thanks to the HR department at Twitter.
That's amazing. Thank you, Twitter, for that amazing story of HR ineptitude. Oh, we could do a whole show just on that. All right, but we shouldn't do that. That, although it would be fun, we should not do that. That would get too many people into trouble. So instead, let's talk about JavaScript. So you said in your origin that you chose JavaScript. You saw JavaScript way back in 2005, 2006. Is this was going to be huge. What made you think that? Why did you make those moves when you did?
That's a good question. So actually, my initial exposure to JavaScript was back in 1998. So it was created in 95. First time I saw it was in 98. I started writing web pages in 1999. I did some web development in college. I worked for at my university which was the University of Oklahoma. Go Sooners. I worked for this student-led, the first completely student-built and student-led student portal. We built it and ran it entirely. The university let us do that. We did the first online elections at any major campus in the United States. So I was part of those early efforts, and I'd seen a lot of JavaScript in those days. But to be quite honest with you, I didn't really take JavaScript that seriously, as most people didn't. So it wasn't until 2003, 4, 5, 6 when you started to see the rise of JavaScript frameworks. That was when at least those of us that were paying attention were saying, if you can write something at that scale in JavaScript, then this deserves to be treated like a first-class citizen. I know, David, you had experience way back in the day with Moo tools. My first exposure, the very first framework I ever had exposure on, I was working on a website designed for an airline, and we had to put a calendar widget on there, and we used the Scriptaculous calendar widget and dropped it on a web page. I think this is like 2006 or something. And so that was my first exposure to other people treating JavaScript really seriously. And I was enthralled by that because I knew programming. I, at that point, had a CS degree, a CS background, but I hadn't really thought that JavaScript could be that. And I started digging in. First thing I ever opened was the jQuery source code. And the first thing I saw was that $ symbol. And I was like, what magic is this? Because I didn't even know that $ was a valid JavaScript identifier character at the time. And I was like, how does it work? And how does the chaining work and all? And I just devoured that source code and tried to replicate it. That's how I decided somebody needs to know how this works, and somebody at large needs to be responsible for helping the rest of the community figure it out. And it was around that same time, I think 2007 or maybe 8, when Doug Crockford released his famous The Good Parts. And it's right at that moment struck me really wrong to say that the way you ought to learn JavaScript is to just learn this small little portion of it, because I was already hooked on wanting to understand all the ins and outs of the language. And I felt like other people should want that too. And then I saw everybody else around me saying, no, just learn this small little subset or whatever. So, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to Crockford for writing that book, because without it, none of us would have JavaScript jobs. It was not going to take off the way that it did if he hadn't gotten such a larger cross-section of the developer community to give it a second chance, if you will. But that's a double-edged sword, because it taught a bunch of people, oh, you don't really need to know the whole language, only just enough to, drop in a plugin and get it done. So,
well, so sort of in those same days, we're all dinosaurs here, so I can talk like this, but in the time frame that you're talking about, right? The main issue and the reason, one of the big reasons that JavaScript frameworks rose up is that I don't know if to blame it on browsers or the spec itself, but things weren't changing, right? Like Internet Explorer had dominance for like a decade, and nothing really happened with the JavaScript language, right? And so when we learned that we could abuse XHR to do these AJAX requests and such, the frameworks pushed us forward from a very low subset of things up onto these, what we have now. And mobile was also a big thrust forward for JavaScript. But my question is, with you having been around JavaScript for this long and having loved it this long, how do you feel about the trajectory that the language is on now? Like I said, it didn't move for a long time, but once mobile started coming out, and I'd like to think that frameworks started pushing things forward, do you think are we doing too much? Are we still not moving fast enough? What is your take on the quickness that the language is moving?
It's a fantastic question. And to just fill in a little bit more of historical detail there, you said, I don't know who to blame. Do we blame the browsers? Do we blame the spec? There's plenty of blame to go around. And I think if we were to bring somebody like a Brendan Eich on, he'd probably say the same thing, right? There's a whole lot of reasons that conspired. In the same time frame, which I think many people now look back and refer to as the dark ages of the web, but we're talking about 2005 to 2008, 9, something like that, when Chrome first came out. Those were really the dark ages of the web. Maybe go back to 2003 and include, pre-Firefox and stuff. But like, those were the days when the web was entirely dictated by the whims of some large corporation. And the only large corporation that really had a big say-so at that point was Microsoft. And at the same time that there were political struggles on what would happen with JavaScript, we had the ES3 standard in 99. And then in 2003, we're trying to get the ES4 standard, and they're basically saying, no, we're not gonna do ES4. It was basically warring factions, and they couldn't agree, so they just gave up. So at the same time that they gave up on doing anything for the future of JavaScript, at least at that time, Microsoft famously said, we think the web's probably not going to go much further than IE6. And they famously, repurposed their human resources to other tasks, and they stopped innovating in the browser space. So you have political factions who can't agree on the spec, and you have the only company who can do anything about the web saying, the future is probably in something else like proprietary plugins. It's no wonder that the web stagnated and almost died. And so you lay that over my tech career. I was working in 2005 and so forth. I was working at a company building web applications when IE5.5 came out, and I remember the eye-opening and jaw-dropping moment when we realized in IE5.5 that you could do an XML HTTP request and what that meant. And so at this time, you have people like me and tens of millions of others, I'm sure, who are fascinated by what we can do with this tech. But the people who are running things are saying, we don't really care, right? And that juxtaposition was really unhealthy for a really long time. And it led to people jumping onto the Flash ship, and it led to people jumping onto the Java plugin, and later into Silverlight and ActiveX and all these other answers for how the web could move forward when there wasn't just one corporation running it. And thankfully, there were some other people who said, we should go start the Firefox browser. And there were some other people like at Google that said, we can build a browser called Chrome. And there were some, people that said, hey, we should put a browser on Mac devices, and we should go build an iPhone and have web be at the center of what the iPhone's going to be. Thankfully, those people had a vision for something different than that proprietary plugin world that it seemed like we were destined for. And so the resurgence of the web, when it reemerged from the dark ages in 2009, 2010, it came in with a vengeance. And people said, man, we've got a lot of catching up to do. So they had to make up a lot of ground with the JavaScript spec, and they had to make up a lot of ground with the technology that was driving it. So we got the browser wars, and performance was the big thing. I mean, Chrome was basically founded to say, we can do web performance better. Let us show you how to build a JavaScript engine that can do it more efficiently. And everybody else jumped on board. And that is so profoundly important to what we do today, that they did that back at that time. And they said, let's go and do that. So when you take that historical perspective into account, and then you ask what's happening with the web today, what many people are referring to when they refer to the progress or the rate of change of JavaScript, they label it as exhaustion, or they label it as fatigue. JavaScript fatigue is that famous phrase that comes around. So my perspective is that we had a tremendous amount of time to make up for. And so it's understandable that there was a lot of pent up, angst and anxiousness to push JavaScript when it really shouldn't have needed that much effort, but we had to because there was such a long period of time where all these huge macro level forces were conspiring against that advancement. The other layer that I'll put on top of that, a personal layer, is, as I was just referring to a little while ago, one of the things that has troubled me almost for the entire time that I've been in JavaScript is this dueling force of, hey, developers should know their tools and they should take pride in their craft. If you asked a C++ developer, for example, have you read the spec? 99 out of 100 of them are going to raise their hands. But when you ask a JavaScript group of JavaScript developers, 1 out of 100 are going to raise their hands and say they've read any meaningful part of our spec. And so one of the reasons why I think we have fatigue over the rate of change is because we've kind of convinced ourselves that JavaScript ought to be easy and simple. And that doesn't fit at all with the demands that have been placed on JavaScript by such a wide constituency. The demands to put 60 frames per second 3D rendering in the browser, and the demands to have JavaScript running in light bulbs and robots and watches and TVs and refrigerators, and all these other demands that are pulling JavaScript far beyond anything that Brendan ever could have imagined. It doesn't fit to think about JavaScript as this, oh, I should be able to glance at it and immediately know it. JavaScript is far more sophisticated than most things that developers could set about to learn right now. When you consider the entire ecosystem, when you consider the language, when you consider all of those constituencies. And so what's really broken here, I think, is that it's our expectation that we should be able to just read a quick little, release notes and, okay, I got it. I know all the new JavaScript stuff. Every time JavaScript releases a new spec, every one of us should be responding with, wow, there's a bunch more that I need to learn. And I need to go find all the blogs and all the books and all the online courses I can to learn all that new stuff. But instead we take it as, oh my God, somebody moved my cheese. I just thought I had it figured out and now they've changed it. That's an attitude problem. And it's one of the things that I've kind of spent my career trying to fight, trying to inspire people that you should approach this as, it's exciting as an opportunity to always have some new thing to learn. So when people ask me what's happening with the pace of JavaScript, what's happening with the changes, there are clearly things that I'm concerned about. There are many things that I disagree with. But one of the things that I'm not concerned about is that JavaScript has a bright future with lots of evolution ahead. The future of JavaScript is far longer than the past of JavaScript, as far as I'm concerned. That's why I think it continues to be a really good bet. And I think the best way to make that bet is to center your perspective around continued education. So I'm a teacher, so I'm biased in that way, but I think that's the way to deal with the fatigue, if you will.
One of the things that I was thinking about during that answer was, you said how the uses of JavaScript have been expanding, and like we're using it in light bulbs and we're using it in electronics, and we're using it in all these places. Isn't part of the reason why we did that because the learning curve of JavaScript is so much simpler than other technologies? Like when you go to say, I want to build robots, what language am I going to do? JavaScript isn't, it wasn't at the time some decisions were made, it wasn't part of that community, right? But people decided, let's use it for that because it's easy. And so is it a bit of a victim of its own success or of its own trait?
I would take issue with that. I mean, I can't speak for everybody, obviously. So it is undoubtable and indisputable that what you're saying certainly was on the minds of some people. It must have been. But I would take issue with the premise that what is good about JavaScript is that it's easy to learn. That isn't why any salient argument could ever have been made to put JavaScript in some other environment, to put it in some other kind of platform. The real argument behind why JavaScript is there are some design decisions that were made that many people think were mistakes, but I consider to be some accidental genius. It took a long time for people to think that some of the stuff that, you know, Newton and you know, Einstein and others were proposing was true, and in some cases, long after their death. I think long after Brendan Eich has come and gone, we're going to be looking back on those early design decisions that he made, and instead of saying for the, you know, trillionth time, "Oh, what a dumb design," I think we're going to be saying that was brilliant, and we couldn't have even possibly foreseen why that would be. And so I think when we say easy to learn, I would twist that and say, I think one of JavaScript's strengths is its approachability. That doesn't make it easy to learn. It makes it easier to comprehend as you're learning. It has a layer of approachability to it that I don't think all languages have. He designed it that way, and the early folks that designed JavaScript designed it in that way because they were always playing catch up. The perception that it was this dumb kid brother was very persistent. And so they needed to, almost in a marketing sense, be more palatable to people. That is not the same thing as it's easy to learn. It's the equivalent of the first thing that you learn comes more naturally to you. There is actually a much wider swath of things to learn in JavaScript than I would say even in C++. I think JavaScript is much more challenging to learn when you consider the entire breadth of it. But your first steps into JavaScript are far more natural and reasonable. That's one of its strengths. Another one of its strengths, one of its design decisions, was it didn't force you to choose a paradigm. If you pick Java, you have to pick the class-oriented paradigm. There's just almost no other option. Yeah, I know there's like some tricks where you can try to be functional with Java, but I mean, Java is class-oriented. Let's just, you know, face it. So many languages force you to choose paradigms, and JavaScript said, let's be a lot of things to a lot of people. Let's be the first true mainstream multi-paradigm language, not only where you can pick these different paradigms, but you can mix and match them in the same program as is appropriate to the task. That's an ultimately pragmatic perspective on the design. And I think the biggest reason why you pick JavaScript is not, hey, JavaScript is easy to learn, or even that it's easy to approach, or even that we have all of this freedom. The biggest reason why you pick JavaScript today, and why you've been picking JavaScript for whatever platform you've been designing for the last 5 years, the biggest reason is because it is the only language that truly won the ubiquity war. Many languages tried, and many languages ended up having to answer ubiquity through closed, locked, vendor lock-in. JavaScript won the ubiquity war by being at the center of the largest open platform that's ever been designed by mankind. So you would be almost remiss in any technical sense to take the option of opting into that community and that ecosystem and that momentum, that wave of momentum that's built around JavaScript, and say, oh, you know what, we're going to go build our whole other thing on this totally new deal. I mean, we're going to get to blockchain a little bit later, but you think about, they literally just announced today, I think, or just in the last day or two, that Ethereum is going to replace their internal VM with WASM, which is JavaScript, the engine. So even if you think about blockchain saying it's probably dumb for us to ignore that is JavaScript. So I think in a larger sense, the reason why people should pick it is because it's already so ubiquitous, which means you can draw talent from a much wider swath. You can share best practices and patterns across that. So coding for a robot, and coding for a light bulb, and coding for a smartwatch, coding for glasses, coding for a laptop, for a phone, and 1,000 other things that I didn't mention. There's a lot of differences, but there's a lot of striking similarities. And one of the coolest things is that JavaScript, the language, is exactly the same in every one of those places. That learning investment pays off so much more broadly than any learning of any other technology that I can possibly imagine.
Awesome. So just quickly, if there were, what is your, what would you like to see next added to JavaScript?
Well, there's definitely been some important improvements in JavaScript in terms of asynchrony. The latest change kind of filled in the last missing gap, I think, in asynchrony was push-pull semantics for multi-value, and we now have that with asynchronous generators that landed in ES 2018. So I think there's gonna be less stress on maturing the asynchronous part of JavaScript as there has been for the last few years. And I think that's going to free us up to pay attention to some other areas that need to mature. One of the features that I'm particularly excited about and looking forward to is pattern matching. That's being championed, I believe, by Brian Turleson, who's the editor of the spec. And I'm real excited about that. And many other languages that already have that, there's reason to say JavaScript is missing that feature. Not just that it'd be a nice to have, but that it's really kind of missing in a sense. So I'm looking forward to that. There's a bunch of little small things that will affordances that will make things nice, but I think a big shift will be that. We just got kind of, it's not fully finalized, but it looks like it's probably going to now hit finalization, which is big int. And that was another huge thing that was missing from JavaScript, was the support for big integers. We now have that, and that will probably be the predecessor to something like big decimal, which maybe fully replaces the IEEE 754 overlords that have hung over us for 25 years now. So I think those are some really big things that are happening for the language itself, that will fill in a lot of the gaps. And increasingly, the old school complaint of JavaScript is buggy, JavaScript is slow, JavaScript is immature, JavaScript is inconsistent. The people that keep saying that are going to be increasingly sounding like the out of touch folks that haven't paid attention to what's really happening. I think if you took an objective look at JavaScript today, you would have to admit that the maturity level of JavaScript is every bit as much as deserving of, any of the other communities out there. We're not that dumb kid brother anymore.
So you mentioned that there's going to be new features, which means there's more to teach. And moving on to you being a teacher, one of the things that we've asked a bunch of people is, do you think that the ecosystem around JavaScript, the tooling, makes JavaScript less approachable than it was, say, 10 years ago? Is the learning curve for JavaScript increasing too much because of everything that we're putting around it?
As with most things, that is an answer that is going to have two sides to it. So first and foremost, unquestionably and indisputably, we've raised the barrier to entry to JavaScript as a collective community by creating this much tooling. And I will put a personal note on that, sort of anecdotally. I've been asked this before, but I would freely tell you that I deeply believe that I would not be able to get a job today if I were to go into a JavaScript job interview, because JavaScript job interviews today don't really ask that much about JavaScript, the language, which is what I've spent the last decade focused on. Now JavaScript job interviews are, all right, so I need you to go ahead and configure Babel and Webpack and then set this up and deliver it over this and package it with this way and make sure you're using Prettier and do you have standard in there, and hey, we need to involve the JSX precompiler. And by the time you get all of that done, then you can write your first line of JavaScript to show that you know something about the language. I know what all of those words are that I just said, but I literally, to save my career, couldn't do any of what I just said. I couldn't set up any of that stuff. I don't keep up with it to that level. I don't use a lot of those things because I'm sort of old school, and man, I hand author my HTML pages, as uncool as that sounds. And so I think we've unquestionably raised the bar. At the same time, all of that was invented for really, really good reasons. by really intelligent people that had really valid problems that they were trying to solve. One of the biggest things that we've done is we've said the problems that teams experience managing software at scale are so bad at scale that we need to invent all of this stuff. And then there's the trickle-down effect that because Facebook started building a bunch of stuff and Google started building a bunch of stuff and Microsoft built a bunch of stuff, well, that means that all the rest of us should be doing all those exact same things, because we should all basically be treating our careers as an audition to go work on a team of 500 at Facebook. I don't know if that's actually the most effective thing that we should have been doing, but that's not really a criticism of the tools. The tools are fantastic. It's really more a criticism of us as a community being so excited that we go jump on these bandwagons. I literally hear people tell me that they, I love this one thing about what React does for me. And then I ask them, did you ever do it without React? And they say, well, no. Then do you even know that you could do it without React? Do you even know how hard it is? Do you even have that perspective of what React is giving you? Well, no, but somebody told me that it was just impossible to do without React. So therefore, I use React. And so it's almost like development opinion by proxy is the status quo these days. And that troubles me. I want people to think. I don't care if you have my same opinions, but I want people to think for themselves rather than just doing what everybody does. So those tools were created for good reasons, but there are tools that are for use in certain scenarios and that may not make them appropriate for the vast majority of projects out there. And so some of that is some self-inflicted complexity, some self-inflicted wounds. And I wish we'd take a step back and say, there are other ways to solve the problems that a medium-sized team, I would say that probably the majority of web developers work on a team of 20 or fewer people. They're not working on teams of hundreds spread across 15 time zones and 4 continents like Facebook is or whatever. So they're not really facing those same sorts of problems. And maybe the solutions aren't the same either. There are ways to solve the problems that your medium team of 10 has, which are real and valid. They don't necessarily need to take those same tools. And again, here's my bias. One of the most effective ways I think you could solve those problems is to go learn your tools better, because then you'll figure out, oh, hey, what if we just did this thing entirely, we'll use this style and this feature in this way, and that will communicate our ideas better. This comes back to a fundamental premise that I have as a teacher. It drives literally everything I do in open source development, teaching, speaking, all of it, which is the purpose of code is not to instruct the computer. The purpose of code is to communicate ideas with other human beings. That's not a unique idea to me, but I believe that so deeply you could almost call that a religious belief at this point. And so if we could learn our tools better and communicate our ideas more effectively in the code that we're writing, our team members will be able to more effectively manage and maintain and extend and fix our code, which means instead of having that conversation like, it would be better if I just rewrote it, the conversation sounds a lot different. The conversation sounds like, I understand what they were doing and I see very clearly where the bug was and I just fixed it. That's what I would sort of at large aspire for the development community to do. And it's why I teach in the way that I do, which is I'm not trying to teach you how to do Webpack. There's a million great teachers out there that are teaching that stuff and have done great videos or whatever. I want you to know the tool itself, the underlying premise of JavaScript, the zen, if you will, of how to ebb and flow with the language, because I think that will make you more effective at building the code first and more effective at maintaining it, the code that your past self or somebody else wrote. And I think that is a way to maybe address the fatigue that people have, the frustration that people have over that much higher barrier to entry that we've created.
So what do you see as a teacher new people to JavaScript struggle with?
Well, setting aside those obvious things like that, I think one of the biggest things that JavaScript developers seem to struggle with is that they look at a language that has these multiple identities, these multiple paradigm identities, and they say, what am I supposed to make of a system that has both a strong functional closure system, and also it seems to be trying to convince me that it's a class-oriented system? What am I supposed to make of that? And I don't think enough people, and I would include myself in this, I don't think enough people are effectively communicating how you navigate those different identities in the language. And so you see people doing really Frankenstein bastardized things, not because they are idiots, but because nobody ever showed them how to juggle those different things and how to effectively intermingle them. I genuinely believe this, and this makes me a heretic, but I believe you could absolutely write a program that in parts was very, very heavily functional programming oriented. And in other parts, you could probably make very good use of class-oriented coding. And in other parts, you ought to just do the pragmatic, simple, straight procedural programming. All three of those have their place in the same app. But we don't hear anybody talking about that. Everybody says, no, 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 you've got to be my flavor of, and most of that, frankly, is dictated by the framework you choose. If you pick this framework, they've already chosen the paradigm for you. And good luck trying to go outside of that. And so I think we could do ourselves a much better favor if we were to help teach in isolation those paradigms, but even more importantly than that, how to effectively navigate and weave those together to make the best program. To me, the best code is not functional or class-oriented. The best code is not React or Angular or Vue. The best code is the code that communicates its ideas most clearly. The best code is the code that is no more than what it needs and no less. It is the bare minimum to get the job done, no more, no less. That creates a smaller surface area for maintenance and bugs, creates a smaller surface area for that next new hire. When you hire them on, and because you don't have any onboarding plan, you just say, go look at our code for the first 2 weeks. Well, if you have a smaller and more modular and simpler code base, that is a much easier task than what most people face when they join today. And so I think we can effectively address those concerns if we start trying to teach people the different identities of the tool and how to sift that out in real world applications, not just in theory.
So before we jump out of teaching, I want to ask you about conference speaking, because you're a prolific speaker. Like I said, you partner with O'Reilly. I've seen your name everywhere. How can people, when it comes to conferences, what do you recommend the attendee expect, and how can they be successful attending a conference that you're at, or any other conference?
I'm going to make what might sound like a controversial statement, but that's not surprising for anybody who knows me, because most of my hot takes are controversial. I think the least important part of any conference are the talks. As a matter of fact, I think conferences ought to do away with the talks. Not do away with them in the sense that no content gets presented, but the talk isn't and shouldn't be the focal point of the experience. The reason that we should be gathering together in these giant expo halls is not to sit quietly in a dark room while one person stands up there and goes through some animated slides. The reason we should be gathering together, and we're missing this. I mean, it sounds silly, but we're missing the most critical thing that we could be doing, which is bringing people together to discuss and collaborate. That term, the term that most people will have heard would have been the hallway track. But I don't just mean this anecdotally. I'm saying we ought to build the conference as the hallway track and get rid of all that other stuff that's distracting from the most important part. Our intercommunication, our interdependence, our intercollaboration with each other. Put the conference talks online in recorded form. Let people watch those for free whenever they want for 3 months. And then have an event where everybody gets together and discusses it and hacks on it and teaches each other and helps each other, go further. That's the conference I'd build if I was ever going to build a conference, because I think that's what we need to be doing. So given that I haven't built that conference and that conference doesn't exist, my advice to you is do go to some talks, do go learn some things, but don't go to a talk expecting to come away an expert. Go to a talk that you think is going to inspire you to find something to dig into a conversation with. And then immediately, right after that, don't go into the next talk. Go find somebody, maybe that was hopefully in that talk, and sit down and chat with them about it, collaborate with them, hack on some code together and try out the ideas, gather a group of people around and have a big, Q&A discussion or open discussion about it. To me, that is how you're going to get more out of your conference experiences, looking for those moments of content to be inspirational that lead to collaboration with other humans.
Todd, I know you feel exactly the same way, don't you? I could see it on your face.
I do. I love everything that you just said, Kyle. I love I love everything you just said. I have, in fact, done talks at conferences about how to get stuff out of how to get the most out of conferences, and a lot of it echoes that. It's about engaging with people. Talks are just to get you started. Like go and meet new people, spend time in the hallway track, go and build new connections with people. And I think that's fantastic. More conferences like that should exist.
I wish they would. And I wish, instead of me going to do it, because I'm too busy, I wish somebody would go take that script and build it.
The problem is that with less structure, there's more like just general chaos of like, how do you get, a company to fund sending people to an unstructured event like that?
I think the companies that would fund that, if we're just brainstorming here about the strategy of conference organizers and getting sponsors, I think the companies that would most want to fund an event like that are companies that want people in the community to hack on that company's particular tools or frameworks or APIs or whatever. They can create those sponsored environments where people can get together and create little mini hackathons, if you will. To me, that seems like a natural fit. There's lots of companies that want the community to participate. They just, they're stuck doing it 20 people at a time, running these little hackathons in every random city of the world. Why wouldn't they want to go create 30 hackathons right in the middle of a giant conference? That seems like a way more effective use of their money and time to me.
So while we're on the topic of conferences and training, I know you've done a lot of work in that space. How can people find information about you and the stuff that you're doing?
Well, that's a good question, because I hope that people are at least a little bit intrigued. So I will give myself a little bit of a plug. So the best way to find me is to look for Getify, Getify, basically anywhere online. So Twitter, GitHub, that's my Gmail address. I freely give out all those things because I want people to find me. I want people to ask me, reach out to me in any way, shape, or form. If you're looking for me on some service and you can't find it, if you type in, literally, if you type in getify.me, which is my personal, quote unquote, personal website, and then a / and then an @ symbol, and then pick any name of some service, if I'm on that service, it'll redirect to my profile on that service. So I've tried to make it as easy as possible for people to find me anywhere. What I do is I write about JavaScript. So I have the You Don't Know JS books. My latest book, which we'll talk about at the end, is Functional Light JavaScript. So trying to give you a pragmatic view on functional programming in JavaScript. So go check those out. Those are on my GitHub. I've got a number of projects, and I teach JavaScript for a living. So if your company would like to have me come teach, email me or tweet me, and I'd love to chat about coming and helping you with that. But I just look for Getify online and you'll find me somewhere.
That's great. So when you're doing this sort of thing, when you're participating and doing training, you've often kind of been an advocate for the web in general. And I think that's kind of in a vein in what in the story you've told us today. You're kind of like an evangelist or an advocate for the web. And lately you've been talking a lot about like service workers. Can you give us some details about what you've been doing with that and what you've been working on?
When people ask me for my job title, since I'm self-employed, I get the freedom to make up whatever I want. And when I make up my own job title, it's Open Web Evangelist, which is peculiar because that doesn't say anything about JavaScript specifically. But I don't think JavaScript is as interesting if you take it out of the context of what it can do. And I think one of the most powerful environments that JavaScript can be used today is on the web. So the Open Web Platform is a natural context within which to discuss JavaScript. That means that I naturally need to be aware of what is the greater web platform doing, what is HTML, what is CSS, what are they doing? And one of the biggest moves that's happened over the last few years is to move web applications out of the browser, if you will, into taking the place of real applications and devices, and that's through progressive web apps, PWAs. And I've long known about the concepts that make something a PWA, like using a service worker for offline ability, like using responsive web design, those sorts of things. I've long known those concepts as concepts, but I decided a few months ago that it would be a good time for me to actually try it myself, instead of it just being the theory of it, that I would really start building it. So I built out a progressive web app. It's not public yet because to launch it publicly means I need to have a business model around it. And so I'm still figuring that part out. But in a bigger sense, it taught me a whole bunch about what it means to build offline and build accessible and build responsive and build adaptive and all of that. And those are all principles that I think that live in the very DNA of what the open web is about. They're the things I think that make the web unique. And they're the things that I think could make the web really have a chance to win out over the last big proprietary vendor lock-in walled garden that we face, which are the app stores. All the others have died and app stores still haven't. And I want app stores to die because they aren't healthy for us to collaborate through. And so I think the open web is our best weapon to kill those app stores. And I don't think we have to do that in a way that makes people not be able to make money. I think you should be able to make money, and you will be able to make money on the web, but to do so in a way that's not entirely driven by the corporate interests of one or two big companies. And so that's why I put all the effort that I do into the open web, is because I believe it has that potential. I believe that the web is the largest platform for self-expression that humanity's ever created, maybe ever will create. And with that comes a tremendous responsibility, I think. So I speak often about why we need to be more inclusive and empathetic about how we work together, how we need to expand this tent of the web to be wider. And one of the things that I think needs to happen there is we need to stop thinking that the way that we build the web is the way that we build it for people that are sitting in San Francisco on coffee shop Wi-Fi. That isn't the only way the web is consumed. I have the privilege to travel all over the world in my capacity, speaking and teaching. And most of the world that I'm in, I experience the web on 2G. I have T-Mobile here in the US, and I'm privileged and fortunate that it means I get free roaming internet wherever I go in the world, but it means that I get to experience it at 2G speeds. So when I load up your website here in the US and I'm one of your customers here in the United States, and then I get on a plane and I fly to Brazil, I'm still one of your customers, but now I'm experiencing this ridiculously unacceptable, subpar, almost unworkable version of the web's reality. And that's not just me. 2/3 of the world's population, if they ever got on the internet, would experience the internet in that way or even worse. And it's not just about internet speed. It's about battery consumption. more than half of the world doesn't have free, unlimited electricity the way we seem to think that we have in the first world countries. And I've been to African villages where people have their phones hanging off of telephone poles, recharging their phones all day long, because that's the only electricity the village gets. And it's such low voltage that it takes all day to recharge a phone. Those people, even if they have a device that can do it, don't want you to shove every possible feature down the wire at them. That gets at, I think, the biggest mistake that we ever made in the web. And I think it's one that we can correct, but it's going to take a lot of work. The most failed assumption and biggest mistake that we made collectively together, and I'm included because I did a lot of this for a long time, is that we made the assumption that if a user's device can do it, then they want it. And we didn't even ask them, what do you want? We didn't build these experiences to ask users what they want. We said, no, our designers, our developers, we're better equipped to decide what you want. And if your device can do it, we'll decide that that's what you want. That isn't how the web needs to be experienced, to be inclusive and empathetic. So I see my job in building out service worker technology and building PWAs, and I'm going to build workshop content around it and write about it. I see my job as an open web evangelist, if you will. I'm self-appointed, but I see myself as in a unique position to bring more attention to that. And since I'm not an employee of Google or an employee of Microsoft, you know that my motives are not based on that I'm going to drive more ads if I do it this way, or that I'm going to get more people to buy my devices if I do it this way. My motive is, this is the most important thing that we've ever built as humanity, and we need to extend it beyond those few big population centers to all the rest of the world. And I don't think we're going to get there the way that we're currently building the web. So a lot of what I'm doing is really just trying to maybe lead by example. I'm going to try to build that stuff and try to talk about it and try to encourage others to build that way as well.
As a quick side note, I was briefly on a team at Mozilla called WADI, and we created the Service Worker Cookbook. And we just started creating that as I had joined the team, and I had never heard of service workers before. You know, people talk about offline, and, you know, application cache was the solution at the time, but application cache wasn't great. And I remember when, you know, they mentioned we're going to do the service worker thing, and I hadn't heard of it. I was like, what's that? And they pointed me to a couple of the pages on MDN, and audibly, and this is like right as I joined the team in the meeting in front of everybody, I said, holy shit. And it was like the first time that I realized that, you know, offline was really going to get this push. We were actually going to be able to do this stuff the right way, so to speak. You know, dropping swear words your first day on the team in the meeting in front of everybody is not the right way to do things. But, you know, along the lines of PWAs and service workers, what are some of the other trends that you see coming up within the next, you know, handful of years for JavaScript and PWAs in the web?
I think the biggest thing that's going to happen is the UI optional revolution. For all of computing history up to this point, we've essentially assumed that there has to be a user interface to consume an application. And I think we're moving into a time when the UI is going to become optional, and applications themselves are going to need to service lots of other paradigms for people, whether that's, you know, a text pop-up on my smartwatch, whether it's a little droplet that shows up in my smart glasses, whether it's simply the colors that change on my refrigerator to let me know that I've got items that need to be replaced. I mean, you just have to start thinking about user interface in a much more broad sense, that the world becomes our user interface. I think that's our next, if I'm a futurist for a moment, I think that's our next big challenge, is to stop thinking about the constraint of this 2D rectangle. And guess what? 3D glasses are not the end-all be-all of that. That's one possible way. A lot of people think, well, that's the new world, is we'll wear these glasses. But I think the new push that we're going to have to figure out collectively is how to go UI optional, or rather how to think about the entire world as the UI canvas. How you're projecting an interface, or a light switch onto a wall in a place where I can interact with it or something. You know, that's going to be, we have to figure out what that means. So.
Cool. So speaking of taking things in the future, you wrote one of the very first JavaScript loaders, way before, anybody was using them, like they eventually got used. Right now you're working on DevCo. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is DevCo, and what are you doing that's 10 years ahead of the curve?
So I'll try to summarize it as briefly as I can with an anecdote about cavemen. If we go back to the days of cavemen and we think about Billy and Jesse, Billy knows how to make fire and Jesse doesn't know how to make fire, and Jesse needs to learn. And it's quite literally a life or death struggle for Jesse, because not only does he need to be able to make fire, he's got to be able to go back and teach all the other members of his family or tribe how to make fire. If we were to try to analyze that scenario, how is Billy going to effectively teach Jesse and all the others that need to know how to make fire? If we took 2018's mindset on this, we'd say, well, clearly what Billy should do is draw a bunch of diagrams about how to make fire up on the cave wall, and then just charge people an entrance fee to walk through his cave and look at the diagrams, and boom, education's done. But if we took a step back and said, would that be effective? We'd actually say, no, that's not how you learn how to make fire. Yeah, you could learn a little bit of the knowledge about fire making from looking at some good diagrams. But what I'm getting at here is that our modern approach to education is that what we need to do is make more content and make more content accessible to more people and more devices. And my perspective is the content isn't the key. The key to education is relationships. Always has been, and I'm going to argue always will be. And to our detriment as a species, over the last 120 some odd years, we basically said, relationships are too hard to scale education. Let's focus on content. And I think by and large, one of the big things that we're not doing well right now is we're not educating people. We're not educating people, and people are not educating themselves. The year of the self-learner, or the age of the self-learner, I think is largely overrated. And I'm also a self-learner, so I'm in that group. I don't think self-learning is the pinnacle of education. It's the exception, not the rule. The rule, the thing that was true for tens of thousands of years of human history, and what we ought to go back to, is education in the context of human communication and empathetic relationship. We'd call that mentoring or coaching today, but nobody can seem to figure out how to do that at scale. Mentoring only happens on one-on-one. So DevCo is my answer to that. DevCo is a set of ideas about how we can create scalable mentoring relationships in the corporate workplace. In essence, I'm trying to upend or disrupt my own industry that I make money at right now. I want to get rid of the way corporate education currently happens. And this is for all skills in the workplace, not just software development. All skills in the workplace can be more effectively taught if they're taught in the context of a mentoring relationship. And there is a way to do that at scale, but it requires much more intelligent and purpose-built tools than currently exist. So that's what DevCo is my attempt to go completely reform and reimagine and reshape, but actually not reinvent. I'm just going to go back to what we did for tens of thousands of years and do it effectively at scale. So that's my startup. That's what I'm working on.
And do we get to use the magical B word?
Blockchain. Yes, everybody.
You include that word, and then investment money just falls
right,
from heaven.
Yes,
that's right. I have not used blockchain in any of my fundraising pitches yet, because the money that tends to come after you say the word blockchain is dumb money. It's not sophisticated or intelligent. It's just based on the hype. And so I don't want that money. But DevCo does have an important part of its future in blockchain. And so one of all these many other things that I'm pursuing over the last several months, I've been pursuing blockchain. You can consider me a recent convert to blockchain, because for a long time I was very skeptical, mostly because the only thing that anybody ever talked about with blockchain was cryptocurrency. I think cryptocurrency is the least interesting part of blockchain, to be honest.
Tell my accountant that.
What's that?
Tell my accountant
Tell
that.
your accountant that. Yeah, I know you famously, you had a bunch of cryptocurrency, I think Bitcoin or whatever. So I'm sure that people that have made a success at it, you know, they have good reason to want that to exist.
But Lambos aside.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's all right. But I think that it's unfortunate that cryptocurrency gets all the attention when actually the really world-changing stuff that I think we can do with blockchain is not about the currency. It's about these other usages of the tech. So in the shortest synopsis I can give you, the reason why blockchain is important and interesting is it allows any two entities, whether they be two companies or two people or a mixture thereof, it allows any two entities that otherwise have contrasting sets of priority. They're competitors, if you will. They don't actually want the same outcomes. So they can't trust each other. It allows those two entities to interact in a way that mutually benefits both of them, but it does so in a way that is completely trustable. So it creates a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, if you will, between two untrusting parties. And in between, we create out of thin air trust. And the way we do that is math. The math behind blockchain is what we can trust. And if we can create a protocol for collaborative data sets that any two entities can say, I have a need for that data set, and you have a need for that data set, and we have competing interests of what we're going to do with that data set, but we can at least agree that that data set will be managed by these principles. Now, all of a sudden, we can collaborate in a way that we never would have before. I think that is the promise of blockchain, and it's why blockchain is going to change the world. So I'm a recent convert to that. And in part, it's because I was facing a set of questions about something I want to do with DevCo. And it literally, I had a shower moment one morning last year, and I realized blockchain is how we fix that. So I set about to create a free-to-use blockchain. When I say free-to-use, meaning you don't have to pay a transaction fee to transact on it. And that's part of what I think can be the next future of the 4.0 of what blockchains can be, is free-to-use blockchains that exist for the public good, much like a Wikipedia, if you will, but with, in blockchain form. Those need to exist for the public good, and I'm building one of those and hope to launch it at some point. DevCo is going to use that to accomplish part of its mission of creating this completely reshaped way of tracking your education cross-job. And that's why I'm interested. Of course, DevCo is also going to include education about blockchain. You're going to need to learn about blockchain. But I've worked with some partners in the blockchain space already. I built out some curriculum for an online school that teaches blockchain development called Hatch. So you should check them out if you're interested in getting more into blockchain. But I'm a believer now, but it took me a long time to get there.
So how does this fit into DevCo? Can you talk about the problem that you solved with it?
Yeah, I can talk about it in a general sense. One of the biggest premises that I have driving DevCo is that you should think about education as a continual process. And that means that it needs to be independent of the place that you happen to be working. If you go to a job and you spend 5 years working there, you're undoubtedly going to learn a set of skills. And then when you go to the next job, you're going to put on your resume those keywords. You're going to say, I learned these things. Now, there'll be things that you learned at the company that are proprietary. but you're still going to talk about the fact that you learned those things, even if you can't share the proprietary information. And so what we have there in that sense is that there's a metadata layer on top of what we learn, which is not what we learned, but how we learned it and who we learned it from. That's a really critical piece. And it's critical that that be independent of where you work, because if I build a platform like DevCo and you learn some stuff while you're a Microsoft employee, and then you leave and you go to another company who uses DevCo, and your profile restarts to 0 because the new company gave, you have a whole new email and a whole new profile. That doesn't reflect reality. That education didn't, leave your mind because you switched employers. So we need a way to track your educational progress independent of the company or the environment that it happens in. And so the blockchain that I'm building is going to give the world a metadata layer for how things are learned and where they're learned from. And DevCo is going to use that.
How can I lie and say that I have 12 years of React experience in this type of environment?
I just need to be your mentor and certify you, right?
That's right. We're going to democratize peer-to-peer certification. So if Todd says you know it, then you know it.
So I'm imagining I have a satellite business to DevCo. DevCo is going to be huge, and I'll just have the side business where you can buy certifications from outside instructors from Acme Co. Everybody has, all developers have at one point or another worked for Acme, and Acme taught you whatever you need to know.
Hey, listen, if I'm building a blockchain, I can't control what people do with it. So go do something great with it.
So, do you think the blockchain, you're a convert, is it going to be as revolutionary as, the Lambo toting David Walshes of the world says it's going to be?
It's going to be more revolutionary than anything that we've seen yet. So I'll harken back to what some of us are old enough to remember when people use the term Web 2.0. And Web 2.0 was supposed to be this new future where the web was comprised of a whole bunch of different data islands in the form of embeddable JavaScript widgets. And you don't need to build your own stuff. Just go embed the Google Maps widget and this calendar widget and this email widget and all these other things. And bam, you just have an app that came out of nowhere. That was the promise, essentially, of Web 2.0, is that third parties could collaborate through embedded JavaScript APIs. And I think it's fair to say that that future was flawed and didn't happen and probably was doomed to fail for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the security model of the web wasn't really built for that originally. But
SharePoint's still around and kicking.
It is. You can definitely still make good money if you're a SharePoint developer. The promise of it, though, hasn't gone away. And the need for it hasn't gone away. It's just how we're going to get there. So I'm envisioning that what blockchain is going to do, if you think about it the way I just described it, which is essentially the data is the protocol, and the protocol enables collaboration between mutually untrusting parties, then what that means is that we can accomplish that vision of mashups, if you will, but mashups where the collaboration happens through those data protocols, through blockchain. I think that's what's going to happen. So I think the Web 3.0 or the Web 4.0 or whatever version you put on it is going to be that. The web is going to be a collection of the exchange of data through these different blockchain systems.
We should point out that we had Daniel Buckner from Microsoft share what was identity, where blockchain is going to be huge there, and he describes a lot of the stuff and agrees with you. Lastly, at the top, we teased a couple of your current projects outside of DevCo, one being CAF and the other being Facey. I'm always excited to see what you're working on. Can you tell us about what those two things are?
Those are my two latest open source libraries. I built those over the last 6 months, 12 months, something like that. And I'm trying to get those out there, if you will, or the awareness of them. So CAF stands for Cancelable Async Flows. It is my approach, which is just one of many, but it is my approach to providing a way for you to do asynchronous actions in JavaScript that are cancelable.
Nice.
And I think it's patching a pretty big missing hole right now, which is that we shipped the async await function in JavaScript and gave us no way to cancel them. And that's a problem, I think. And so CAF is an attempt to do that in a better way. So if you've had issues around cancellation, or if you haven't even thought about cancellation, I'm going to tell you, you should. I think almost every form of asynchrony that we can do in a JavaScript application needs the potential for cancellation built into it. We do so much asynchrony. There's AJAX calls, which are obvious, but there's timeout-based calls. We have cross-frame messaging. We have on the server side basically the entirety of Node's APIs, from file systems to databases to that is, I mean, that's a massive amount of asynchrony. I can't think of a single example across any of those where what I want to do, if I'm really thinking about it, is I want to fire off an asynchronous request, and I don't care how long it takes. Take as long as you want. There's always going to be a timeout. There's always going to be a length of time where I don't want, if that file system command has taken 5 minutes, then stop, right? So I feel like there's this massive gap where we're doing all this asynchrony and nobody's talking about how it needs to be canceled. And so CAF is an attempt to try to look at that. Phasey is also in the asynchronous space, but from a very different angle. There is this, people know about iterators like for each, map, filter, reduce, things like that. Iterators are what we call eager synchronous in the functional programming world. So if I call a filter, it's going to go over a list of all the values that are currently there. But what if the operations that we want to do on those eager operations, what if those are asynchronous in nature? What if the mapping of one value to another value can't happen synchronously? It needs to make an AJAX call, for example, to get it. What we need is a form of asynchronous iteration, not like observables, which are waiting for new data to come in. So these are still eager. These are still eager iterators, but they're eager asynchronous iterators, meaning that I'm going to eagerly go over the data source, but each step of that may be asynchronous. That was a missing gap, I feel, where people wanted to be able to do a for each, but have it pause in between each step, for example. And you can't do that with the current set. So what Phasey is a very small library that lets you have eager asynchronous iterators, and it provides both serial and concurrent flavors of each of those. So you can either do a serial for each if you want each one to go one after the other, or a concurrent for each if you want them to happen concurrently in parallel. So it's just a small set of iterators to allow that kind of asynchronous iteration.
And we can get those at github.com/getify.
They're all on my GitHub. So CAF is CAF and Phasey is FASY. So go look for those on my GitHub profile.
Right after the show, I'm going to look at CAF because I want to figure out how you did the cancel. I'm so excited for that.
It's cancellation tokens. That's the punchline there. Cancellation tokens are how I think it should be done.
And I'll post links in the show notes when we're done. I think that is a good place to kind of wrap it up. We're a little bit over our normal time, but I think we had a great conversation today. As per usual, we're going to go around and kind of say like one big thing that we think is our takeaway. David, what about you? What did you think?
I've been learning from Kyle for so long that it was just a pleasure to talk to him. And it's even more awesome that he's on the blockchain bandwagon. I'm going right to my Lambo dealer after this because Kyle says that crypto is the least interesting thing and it's the most interesting thing to me, so it must be going somewhere. But no, I also really enjoyed your philosophy on education being not just about content, but more about relationships. And I couldn't agree with that more. How about you, Todd? What'd you learn today?
I really like the nuance that Kyle pointed out around JavaScript isn't easy to learn. It's the first thing you learn is intuitive. And it makes, taking that first step easier, but that its surface area is actually much bigger than most other programming communities because of, all of the variance that can happen there. I think that's a really important distinction. And I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but I think that makes a lot of sense. Kyle, we're going to give you the last word about, summarize anything you'd like to do or plug something if you'd like.
Okay, quickly, my final word here is I talked earlier about teaching corporate trainings. If your company would like to have me come do a corporate training, I would love to do that. So reach out to me. Best way to get me is either through Twitter or just email me, which is getify@gmail. And the last plug that I'll make is my most recent book, which I mentioned earlier, is the Functional Light JavaScript book. If you've ever been interested in functional programming but been confused by terms like monads and endofunctors, I'm not going to explain any of those things in the book, but what I am going to do is show you how to learn functional programming and pragmatically and in a balanced way apply it to your JavaScript programs without all of that crazy terminology or the notation or math degree or anything like that. I'm going to try to give you a very ground up approach. And that's the aim of that book. As with all my books, you can read it for free, so check it out and see if you like it first. But it is available for sale, and I, of course, appreciate when people appreciate my work if they buy those things. So definitely check that out. As a special for the listeners of this podcast, we're going to be releasing a coupon code that'll give you 50% off buying the Functional Light book from LeanPub. So definitely go check out that coupon if you're interested. So find me to come teach your corporate workshop. Find me on platforms like Front-End Masters. Find me on GitHub. Find me on Twitter. But most of all, go learn JavaScript. It's an investment that'll keep paying off. And I've got, well over a decade now of career proof to that. So keep going with that. And I don't think you'll regret those investments at all. But thanks very much for having me on the show, guys. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. I think all three of us are kind of behind that summary of go learn JavaScript. Go take training from Kyle. Go read about things as David learns them on his blog, and then go monitor them with the stuff I work on. So I think we're all on the yay JavaScript wins bandwagon.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I think we had a great show. An hour and 20 minutes. I think it's our longest yet, and tons of people have already watched it. So I think it's a great success. We will be back next week on the 27th with our next guest. Chris Coyer is going to be joining us. That's
you definitely want to go to that one. Don't listen to Mike. Go listen to Chris Coyer. He's awesome.
So we will be back on the 27th. Hope you tune in and check us out then. Until then, thank you so much, Kyle, for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'm Todd Gardner.
I'm David Walsh. See you later.
Thanks a lot.